Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, whatever time you're watching this. My name is Jessie. I am part of the Assistive Technology Advocacy Center, and I am here today with three of our Disability Rights New Jersey interns for the 2026 summer. They are going to be presenting on language use within the disability community.
Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, evening, wherever you are. My name is Danielle Ahern, and I'm the 2026 Investigations and Monitoring Intern.
Hello, everyone. My name is Fia Joseph. I'm an NJCDD intern or New Jersey Council on Developmental Disabilities intern.
Hi, everyone. My name is Rachel Barry. I'm an NJCDD intern, and thank you all for viewing our presentation today.
And the name of our presentation is Language Use Within the Disability Community. So let's begin.
First, we're going to talk a little bit about person versus identity first language and the significance that it has within this general conversation regarding language and the disability community. So first, I think it's important to establish what exactly is considered right or wrong. A lot of the times, preference can come from people's experiences, and there really isn't a right or wrong unless you are using language that perhaps is hateful or you're not respecting the wishes of the people whose language you're impacting, right? So, as we go through this presentation, we really urge you to consider how do you use language when talking about disability in your personal life versus your professional life, and how can this impact the people we serve? Like we mentioned, preference often comes from people's experiences and a bunch of things that can shape the experiences that people have. For example, when language is being used, do people feel that the descriptors that people are using to identify them, um, do they feel that's a part of their identity? And how have others used language in referring to them? How did that make them feel? Did they have a say in that experience? Did they have the ability to practice their agency and set boundaries in what they do and don't prefer? When in doubt, it's always a good idea to open the conversation, especially because it can show that you are respecting the person's autonomy and agency in choosing how they're referred to and what conversations they have. Next slide, please. So, just a quick review of person versus identity first language. Person first language refers to how, for example, you may say a person with a disability or a person with autism, right? For example, identity first language is where you put the descriptor before um, acknowledging the person. For example, you may say disabled person, someone, autistic person, etc., right? So the preference for this language can be different in different communities. Oftentimes, especially in speaking about mental health disabilities, um, there are different preferences for language based off of, again, people's experiences, what has been stigmatizing in their experiences, perhaps what has helped them get services, etc. So, for example, substance use, right? People may feel that the term addict is very stigmatizing and isolating. Other people have felt that it helps them build a recovery mindset. So, again, there's no universal when referring to a lot of these concepts, really. It's just important that you're respecting the autonomy and the agency of the people that you are referring to in this conversation. On the other hand, with the conversation of homelessness, a lot of people prefer person first language when discussing homelessness because they feel that their homelessness is a condition rather than an identity. Um, Again, a lot of people may also feel that using the term homeless people has less jargon and is more easy to understand. So again, as we discussed throughout this presentation, it's really important that you are respecting the preferences of the people who have lived experience in this conversation. Next slide, please. Thank you. But yeah, so at the core of our conversation is disability, generally speaking, all types of disability. So in the debate between person and identity first language, do you use person first language, person with a disability, or identity first language, saying disabled people, right? So again, this conversation is not one size fits all. A lot of it has to do with the preference of people with lived experience and the impacts of language that may have on them. Next slide, please. So in my preparation for this presentation, I went on social media and I found a variety of posts that advocates have posted on Instagram. And I made sure to take account for different perspectives in this conversation regarding preferences for person versus identity first language. So in this first slide, you'll see that a creator posted a video and someone in the comments had mentioned that they would prefer that the creator use person first language, right? And the creator here explains that a lot of the people in the video actually were autistic, had lived experience in the disability community, and that they prefer identity first language. This creator really emphasizes that while individuals feel that they're not defined that by their disability, it's a part of their identity and should be recognized. And oftentimes, these people feel that identity first language does not dismiss other aspects of their identity, rather helps them embrace their experiences. And they make a good point that just because person first language is what they may have been taught is polite, it's not necessarily the preference of all people. Next slide, please. So for this slide, I did a bit of a tweet that I found. And it says here, like, you don't call a person or a blonde person a person with blondness, or a tall person a person with tallness, right? Similarly to the last post, this post recognizes that a lot of the times disabled, autistic, different descriptors are a part of their identity and can be used as an adjective, right? While that's not all encompassing of what the person is, it's an aspect of their identity. Next slide, please. Now this slide here kind of takes on another perspective that's in favor of identity first language. You'll see here with the stick figures, it's more shaded in under the side that says an autistic person because this author feels that identity first language recognizes the whole person as opposed to person first language. They feel that person first language perhaps is not all encompassing of their identity and does not recognize their autism as part of their identity. Next slide, please. Here, I put person first language into an AI search, and I found this to be interesting. The APA actually had posted guidelines arguing that person first language should be the default and that person first language is the most polite way of referring to people with disabilities, right? Nowadays, the guidelines are more updated. It actually guides that people use language based off of preferences and people's experiences, kind of like we've been talking about in this conversation. And yet, there are also a lot of advocacy groups that are still calling for person first language as well, right? Kind of like we've been saying, this is not a universal conversation. There are people that have preferences on both sides. Some people will prefer person first language, some people will prefer identity first language. And that's not to discount anyone's experiences or preferences. Next slide, please. Circling back to the conversation regarding mental health disabilities, in recent years, there's been more of a movement to start using that terminology as opposed to a person with mental illness or a mentally ill person, because a lot of people in the community feel that referring to people's conditions as illnesses is inherently stigmatizing and isolating for people in the community. Perhaps it makes them struggle to get services because of conceptions that may not necessarily be accurate or true regarding their experiences, right? This particular advocate advocates that person first language is used in the conversation regarding mental health disabilities, although, again, this is not necessarily a universal experience. Just kind of another perspective on the conversation regarding mental health disabilities and how people in the community may have different preferences. Next slide, please. Thank you. And then here we have some more person first language preferences. So on the left-hand side, there's a tweet and it says that person first language is the most accurate and respectful way of referring to people that have disabilities, and that it can help eliminate stereotypes, and that this author generally prefers person first language. Same with the graphic on the right. They emphasize the need for strength-based language in the person first language conversation, which Rachel will talk a little bit about in a bit, and essentially how the use of person first language perhaps has helped these authors be able to connect with people regarding their experiences in the disability community. Next slide, please. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the impacts that language can have on individuals in the community, particularly how language can kind of create a conflict between pride and isolationism. So on one hand, reclaiming language and using language as a tool to express identity can really help people in the community in this conversation. And language can often be used as a tool to connect with people over shared experiences. In my own experiences, I actually am beginning a student advocacy group at Ramapo College with some of my friends regarding the disability experience, and we found that identity first language really helped us connect over our shared experiences, and that we felt that we didn't have to beat around the bush when we were using identity first language. And the same can be true for people on the other side of the coin. A lot of the time, person first language can be really helpful in acknowledging someone's personhood before the experiences that they have with their disability. So, all in all, both sides of the coin, it can help bring out disability pride. And yet, there's also a real worry that we can isolate people in the disability community if we're not careful. For example, language can be used to create stigma around identities. It can help, not help, it could prevent people from being able to get the services they need because of the impacts of that stigma. So, for example, we'll talk more about it. For example, in accommodation meetings, stigmatizing language can be really hurtful in helping people get services that they are entitled to. And not only that, language can be used to create misunderstanding and bias when not used intentionally or hatefully. And so, truly, it is important that we are honoring the preferences and autonomy, and that we're respecting people in the disability community in the conversations that we have around language.
Right, thank you, Danny. So once again, my name is Rachel Barry, and the first topic I'll be discussing today is strength versus deficit-based language. Next slide, please. So strength-based language refers to language that focuses on an individual's capabilities, knowledge, motivation, and use of resources. So some examples of this could include Martina uses an AAC device to communicate. Tom thrives in structured environments with predictable routines. On the other hand, deficit-based language refers to or focuses on what a person cannot do, often using medical terms. So some examples of this could be Martina is nonverbal, which, as an aside, the preferred term here would be non-speaking because there are forms of language and communication other than spoken word. Another example could be Rebecca has quadriplegia. So strength-based language is preferred because it empowers individuals, emphasizes the whole person, and builds individual confidence and trust. You should aim to use this language whenever possible, and especially in direct interactions with people with disabilities. Next slide, please. However, it can sometimes be necessary in certain advocacy contexts in order to demonstrate a need for a service or accommodation to use deficit-based language. If possible in these instances, you should debrief clients about the necessity of deficit-based language in the context. So you could say something like, we're trying to make a good case for you to receive the support you need. So you may hear us focus on the challenges you face on your work stay. This is not meant to paint the full picture of your strengths, potential, or who you are as a person. Saying something like that can go a long way. Additionally, try not to use global labels of ability, such as low functioning. Focus on individual support needs instead, because in addition to the term low functioning being a bit derogatory, someone may not need much support in one area, but need a lot of support in another area. So it's best to be specific. Supplement with strengths-based language where possible. So for instance, you could say the client is able to live independently and maintain part-time employment when given support with daily living tasks. This can also support advocacy efforts by demonstrating that the individual has the capability and motivation to make good use of the services and accommodations they're given. I also want to caution here that over-reliance on deficit-based language can discourage self-advocacy and participation in the decision-making process. And this is an especially relevant consideration when working with disabled youth who may already be vulnerable to self-esteem issues and feel uncomfortable advocating for themselves. And I have a case example of this on the next slide that I'm going to read. Emma is a high school student who receives accommodations for her ADHD through her IEP. During one of her IEP meetings, a special education advocate uses heavily deficit-based language to describe Emma's experience of her disability within her classes, saying things such as, Emma routinely struggles with completing assignments on time. She has poor organizational skills, and she is often unable to complete longer tasks without frequent redirection. This makes Emma feel humiliated and insecure about her abilities. The next time one of Emma's IEP meetings rolls around, she remembers the painful experience of the last meeting and, not wishing to repeat this, she declines to participate. Although the advocate may have simply been trying to make a good case for Emma to receive accommodations, their disproportionate usage of deficit-based language relative to strengths-based language has created an environment that makes it more difficult for Emma to have a say in her education. So next slide, please. Thank you. How can we adjust this language to make it more balanced? Instead of saying Emma routinely struggles with completing assignments on time, we could say something more like Emma would benefit from support with time management to help her more consistently meet deadlines. Instead of saying something like she is often unable to complete longer tasks without frequent redirection, we could say something like Emma has difficulty following spoken instruction for longer tasks and responds well to written instructions and visual aids. So now that I've gone over when it's appropriate to use strength or deficit-based language, I want to talk about language that is inherently harmful to use. And obviously, I won't be able to cover all the forms of harmful language towards the disability community in this presentation, but I want to focus on 3 forms in particular, the first of which is microaggressions. So the APA defines microaggressions as everyday derogations, slights, and invalidations that are often delivered to people of minority or marginalized backgrounds. The term was originally coined by psychiatrist Chester Pierce to refer to hostile behavior towards African Americans, but its usage has since been expanded to include hostility towards other marginalized groups. So there are 3 main forms of microaggressions. The first is microassaults. These are explicit prejudicial attacks intended to hurt their targets. So some examples of a microassault could be using an ableist slur against a disabled person, mocking a person's movements, speech patterns, or use of a mobility aid. And the impact of these microassaults is obviously not micro, but it's considered a microaggression because it involves an everyday interpersonal interaction rather than direct systemic discrimination. Micro-invalidations are remarks that invalidate or dismiss the targeted person's experiences, often made unconsciously. So, for example, telling someone they don't look disabled, treating disability as something to be overcome, telling someone they don't really need their accommodations, or denying others' experiences of ableism. So if someone tells their friend, I had a really hard time getting into this building because there's no accessible entrance, and their friend goes, well, I'm sure there's another entrance somewhere you could have used, or, well, this building is just kind of old. It's not really like they're intentionally trying to exclude you or discriminate against you. That would be a micro-invalidation. Micro-insults are remarks that demean a person's identity through rudeness and insensitivity. Some examples of this would be medical staff calling a patient a frequent flyer, or asking someone with a disability invasive medical questions or questions about their bodily functions. Those would all be micro-insults. And although these last 2 forms are usually not intentionally hurtful, this does not excuse their perpetrators. And it's important to emphasize the actual impact on the victims of these remarks, which can be very profound, even if the microaggression only came from a place of ignorance. Next, we have euphemisms. Some common examples of these include differently abled, handy-capable, or special abilities. There are several problems with using these euphemisms. First, avoiding the term disabled can imply that the construct of disability is inherently negative, and we shouldn't need to use these phrases to know that people with disabilities are capable and have strengths. If people are avoiding using the word disabled because when they hear that word, they default to thinking that someone is incapable, then we have larger issues. Euphemisms can also be patronizing and stigmatizing. So using euphemisms can come off as talking down to people with disabilities, like, wow, you're so capable. Very infantilizing language. Using the term differently abled can other people with disabilities by implying that people with disabilities are aberrant from a normal baseline level of ability. Additionally, euphemisms can invalidate the social and medical realities of disability, undermining the work necessary to eliminate systemic barriers. For instance, someone using a wheelchair isn't able to use stairs differently. They aren't able to use stairs, and therefore a ramp needs to be built. Another form of harmful language towards the disability community that often comes up is language surrounding accommodations and supports. For some reason, disabled people receiving equal access seems to rile a lot of people up. These are real comments I've compiled under videos of disabled creators discussing the accommodations they use. And I'll read them out loud just as a warning. Some of them are pretty vile. They leave their houses and make their issues everybody else's issues. She is extremely unlikable. Where's natural selection when you need it? Dude, at that point, just stay home. Stop being entitled. This just feels entitled. Next slide, please. These are all some more examples that I've seen in the past. He's using his classroom accommodations as a crutch. So this one is kind of a double whammy. It's both invalidating someone's need for a particular accommodation, as well as invalidating general use of mobility aids. Another is saying someone is confined to a wheelchair or wheelchair bound. So wheelchairs and other mobility aids do not limit or constrain their users, but instead allow them to access spaces and be independent. Also, calling someone entitled for requesting accommodations. People are entitled to equal access under the law. They're not being arrogant or asking for too much by trying to enjoy the same rights and privileges as everyone else. Also, sometimes people call the use of accommodations special treatment, an unfair advantage, or high maintenance. And again here, accommodations are not a luxury. They're a necessary tool to level the playing field and create equity for disabled people. Next slide, please. So hopefully, if you can recognize these patterns of harmful language, you're in a better position to call them out. This is very important because failing to speak up allows the use of harmful language to proliferate. And I think this is especially true in the age of social media, where people say things online that they normally wouldn't say in person. But if that's not corrected, that just emboldens people to start using that language in person. So here is where intent is actually important, because understanding the person's intent can inform your approach in discussing the offending language. So don't always assume malicious intentions without getting more information. Oftentimes people just say things out of ignorance. And if the harm was unintentional and the person is open to feedback, you can sort of call them in and educate the person on why the language they used was harmful. You should explain the impact of such language, offer alternatives if available, and communicate future expectations. Like, if you're not sure whether a certain term or phrase is harmful, please feel free to ask me, or maybe look into what members of the affected community have to say about it. On the other hand, if the harm was intentional or the person is not being very open to feedback, this needs to be publicly called out with clear boundaries set and consequences introduced if possible. Document the behavior as much as possible to ensure accountability. And I want to emphasize here, lastly, that saying something is usually better than saying nothing. You won't always have the perfect words in the moment, but by speaking up, you could be the reason an environment becomes more welcoming towards people with disabilities. Thank you for your time. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Fia.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to continue with our fifth section on intersectionality. So next slide, please. So intersectionality is a complex subject, not only when it comes to language, but also society as a whole. The thing about language, it has power, intent, and context behind it. It is impossible for language to be cut and dry when we look at the history of words, the meaning of words, even things like tone. When I want to think of intersectionality, I like to think of a Venn diagram. People are not an or, but instead an and. It's important to think about that as we look at the intersectionality with disability and different identities, whether that is gender and disability or race and disability. All these identities form together. And so with the Venn diagram, think of any person, for example. For me, I'm not black and or a woman. I'm black and a woman. Both my identities intersect with each other and make me into who I am today. We can't separate identities, and so it's important when we talk about disability and intersectionality, understanding the complexity and honestly the interwoven struggles within language. I think especially for DRNJ, this issue of intersectionality gets a lot more complex. Although intersectionality can be powerful and emboldening for people when it's their identity, other people can use intersectionality in ways of harm. They might look at someone and choose to use harmful language that affects both parts of their identity. And so DRNJ works to advocate for disabled people. So I think as we go through this final section of the presentation, we should all keep in mind this question. How can we keep in mind helping other people without understanding the full extent of their identity? Is that possible? And how does the language choice we use help or harm our clients and even the people within our community? And so this is an interactive exercise. Obviously, we are online right now, so you can do this to yourself or just think about it as I talk. I did these two scenarios with scenario A and scenario B. As is previously touched on, there is no wrong answer typically when it comes to learning about language, language use, and how we interact with each other. But it's important to keep in mind always remaining respectful and open to understanding and learning. So my first scenario, look at the difference between these two sentences. He doesn't talk to people versus she's shy at first. Look at the inflection points I used, how he doesn't talk to people. Oh, but she's shy at first. Here's it without the tone. He doesn't talk to people versus she's shy at first. Here's our second scenario, scenario B. The student is disruptive versus the student struggles when the routine changes. Once again, without the inflection, this student is disruptive versus this student struggles when the routine changes. Does the wording seem identical to you? Oh, sorry, last slide still. Yeah. Does the wording seem identical? Does the context behind the message seem identical? Did the tone change? Did the tone stay the same? If you look at both these scenarios, we see these subtle nuances that change how these words are spoken and what these messages mean. He doesn't talk to people. It has more of an accusatory statement to it. She's shy at first. It feels more open, more understanding. And then scenario B, the student is disruptive. It's cut and dry. There's no room for debate or change. But the second one, this student struggles when the routine changes. We see the student is capable of accepting things, but when the routine changes, it's difficult. You see the difference between these phrases. Suddenly we go from accusatory and looking at people with harm, even if it's not said with harm, the intent matters, the tone matters, the context of why we're saying thing matters. And that's why this nuance is really important. And another thing we really want to keep in mind, every person in this world, in this room, in this webinar, will have different answers how they view these statements. These can be based off our unique lived experiences, whether that's our religion, our background, our hometown, our family, our ethnicity. Every way we've lived, our personal preferences, our beliefs will shape how we view tone and words and languages. So I want you to keep in mind throughout this conversation, there's very few times where a one-size-fits-all approach works. Instead, remain open to learning and open to understanding. So now our second slide, please. So this is the Rubik's Cube metaphor. To me, the Rubik's Cube metaphor stood out to me because of how perfectly encapsulates intersectionality. So if you're going to look at the first row, we see this race, socioeconomic class, and gender. Although this might seem confusing when you first look at this, when you understand how intersectionality works, it makes a lot more sense. No one is a single issue person, and no one has only one part of their identity. For someone, they could have their race intersecting with their socioeconomic class and their gender. For others, you might have race, ethnicity, and immigration status. For others, also, we have ability, sexual identity, and socioeconomic class. And looking at the quote next to it, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not live single issue lives by Audre Lorde. This Rubik's Cube becomes important as we understand more about disability. Black and minority students have been overdiagnosed for high incidences of disability and underdiagnosed in low incident categories. So what is high incident categories versus these low incident categories? So high incident categories are more subjective categories, like how a student could be diagnosed with oppositional defiance disorder versus ADHD. But what are the differences between these? That's open to questions. It's open to your personal views and the subjectivity of it. We can also look at gender gaps for diagnosis as well. So, women, as we know, have historically faced oppression throughout the world, but specifically in terms of the emotional department. Women are often told that they are hysterical, they're dismissed and taught to compartmentalize their issues. And we see that all these things form together to create a comorbidity, where women, for example, might be more likely to be diagnosed with mental health issues as a result of compartmentalizing issues. And so, all these things within our Rubik's Cube become important when we think about how students, for example, are treated. So I have this statistic that stands out to me, unfortunately. Nearly 75% of special education students have been suspended or expelled at least once. Intersectionality is important because all of these systems of oppression weave together to create harm, but they can also lead to progress and empowerment. The ADA, or the Americans with Disability Act, it was inspired by the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But much like I said, there's also room for harm. What has stood out to me for the last couple of years and got me interested in disability advocacy was a statistic found by the University of California, Los Angeles, or UCLA. 80% of autistic women are undiagnosed as of the age of 18. They have these high levels of masking to conform to society. Autism historically was viewed as a boys only trait, and so boys are actually 10 times more diagnosed than girls. And it has to do with how autism is exhibited differently in men versus women. Therefore, if women are viewed as having acceptable interests, like if they really like horses, for example, or they're really into celebrities, that's viewed as more acceptable. Therefore, they don't get the diagnoses they need. They don't get the accommodations they need, which leads to what I mentioned before, the comorbidities of anxiety, depression, and even OCD. This relates back to DRNJ, especially because clients can face both harm and neglect. The intersectionality of their identity can inflate ableism, sexism, or even racism. All these things form together to create this oppression that's weaved together, essentially. And we also know that an important part of understanding how intersectionality works is looking once again at language. Because as we know, our stigma, our biases, and our beliefs will affect our language. So clients, for example, at DRNJ can face belittling language and even negligent treatment because of intersectionality forming against them. Slide from before, please. So I wanted to give an example of something that happened to me personally. When I was 19 years old, I was looking to get diagnosed with autism. I had realized a lot of the symptoms I've exhibited my whole life were very similar, especially the comorbidity where I had had OCD. And I went to my doctor and I had like 4 pages of bullet points listing all the symptoms I've exhibited and everything that made me realize that it was very likely that I had autism my entire life. And after I told him all these things in a very vulnerable moment of my life, he looked at me and he said, I couldn't have autism because I made eye contact. I couldn't have autism because autistic teenagers were like Napoleon Dynamite, a verbatim statement of what he said. I wanted to bring this up because for me, in that moment, I knew my doctor did not want to hear what I had to say. He only cared about what he believed and the biases he held, and his language showed that bias. I ended up being diagnosed a year later by a female doctor through a comprehensive diagnosis where I was actually heard and seen. We need to keep all these issues in mind because a one size all fit does not work when we talk about the needs of disabled people. This quote is by Jen Derenwater from Crushing Colonialism. She's a member of the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. So what she talked about that stood out to me is how for her growing up in Oklahoma, she saw how poverty had become a compounded issue in her community. For example, because of poverty and the underfunding of Native communities, healthcare became ignored. It was underfunded. People were not receiving the support they needed nor the care they needed, therefore creating these compounded needs for these historical injustices to modern day. So next slide, please. So As I've talked about quite a lot, language impacts the RNJ's needs, especially with the intersectionality. And although we know legal frameworks can be beneficial and life-changing, language in these legal frameworks is not always cut and dry, unfortunately. As previously mentioned, deficit-based language is highly important in certain scenarios, but we must always keep in mind language has intent and impact. And so in this slide, I'm going to be talking more about how biases, language, and harm, they form together. I want you to keep in mind how subjective language can be. For example, as I mentioned previously, what makes one person defiant and another person someone who dislikes change? These are both vague statements that could really mean anything. And so this relates to law and disability specifically. Disabled people of color are more likely to be harmed in police encounters. Elijah McCain was a Black man with chronic asthma. He was killed during an instance of police brutality when he was put into a chokehold and then forcibly sedated. Instances like this, we see how race, disability, all these things form together. His harm was proportionate to his disability and his race. And I think we need to keep in mind as we look at these intersectional identities, what does it mean to look suspicious when we add in the nuances of race, disability, and oppressive systems? As we see police brutality increase, we also need to think about the complexity of people and their identity. And so another example, as I previously mentioned, nearly 75% of special education students have been suspended or expelled at least months. And then once again, how Jen Deerenwater talked about these compounded needs in Native communities. All these identities can be built on historical pride and historical injustices, but once again, we must look through the pride and realize what can we do to benefit our people more. By looking at the different forms of identity, we can understand things better. Intersectionality was actually created as this framework by a civil rights scholar, Kimberly Crenshaw. She wanted to examine how racism and patriarchy affects Black women specifically together. By looking at the law and looking at historical instances and social movements, we can see how intersectionality creates an important framework for identifying injustice. Next slide, please. So to look at intersectionality, we have to once again talk about pride. Pride has been a thing, I don't know, as long as communities will exist. And I chose these three instances that stood out to me within the last 50 years, I believe. So if you look at the left, we have the second wave feminism movement. In this movement, women advocated for the rights to equal pay, to be out of the home with books like The Feminine Mystique, and being able to be whoever they wanted with their own autonomy. And then once again, we see the 504 sit-in. During the 504 sit-in, disabled advocates like Judy Heumann staged a sit-in in a federal building, advocating for the right to accessibility and autonomy in funded buildings and funded services in general. And then more recently, Obergefell v. Hodges. In the last 10 years, we saw gay marriage was legalized, therefore ensuring gay rights throughout history. These moments were all representing pride and how intersectionality works together. As I previously mentioned, the civil rights movement, it empowered all of these moments together to realize they can fight against injustices and create intersectionality where one person's struggle is every person's struggle. And so these distinct movements, they form together to fight against inequality. And we need to think about why this is important to DRNJ specifically. We had watched the movie previously about the Willowbrook State School. It was a state school where disabled children specifically were sent, and they received neglectful and, quite frankly, negligent harm there. And one thing that stood up for me from during that film was when the reporter, Geraldo Rivera, he went to California and he saw a much better hospital with children who were able to thrive. As Geraldo talks to the doctor, there was a young child with Down syndrome, about a toddler's age. The child was very happy and joyful, and the doctor said how the child was thriving right now. When she went home, her parents were able to help her, and when she came to the hospital, she was also receiving treatment and care. And I remember Geraldo asked if this child was at a place like the Willowbrook State School, where she received no mental stimulation, no therapies, no support, no contact with her parents, would she still be thriving? And the doctor said no, she would not be thriving. So as we look at these intersectionalities and how empowerment ultimately leads to betterment for the all of society, think about these questions. Is a person with disabilities disruptive, or have they never received the care that they needed to fundamentally survive? Is a person with disabilities asking for too much, or are these the things they need to live, to survive, to function, to have their own self-determination, essentially? And then our next slide, please. So next, we're going to cover my last little subject about the impact of language. Next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So language impact can be seen through the film Crip Camp, based off the real experiences of teenagers with disabilities at Camp Jened. Camp Jened was a camp where children and teenagers with disabilities could come to find accessibility, community, and empowerment. As I mentioned, Judy Heumann, the mother of disability rights movement, she was a camper there. And because of her experiences being at Camp Jened, she was able to realize that fighting for accessibility was a right that she deserved, a right that every person in the United States got, and she should not be deprived of it because of her disability. And so, what I really liked about this movie, I think something beautiful about this is how when these children were there and these teenagers were there, they were able to exist without feeling different. Whether it was they were able to see people who were just like them, using mobility aids, experiencing life like first kisses, they saw themselves and they believed they could be more than what society had told them. And so as we think about this, I want you to understand how how language and our biases, they can be impacted because ultimately people with disabilities are capable of thriving. Much of the language society has chosen to use centers around the things people with disabilities cannot do, the deficit-based language. When we look at the things people with disabilities can do, we're able to see this thriving and beautiful environment. So Representative Tony Coelho, he was the architect of the Americans with Disability Act, a fundamental law throughout the land that made accessibility the norm legally. And he said this quote that stood out to me. I thank God for my epilepsy because it made me a stronger, better person. But a lot of us in the community feel that way. We don't feel like we're handicapped. We feel like we got something that makes us better and stronger, and we're going to be out there fighting. We cannot simultaneously reject people's needs as disabled people and be upset when they cannot do things. Things like accessibility, things like accommodations, things like empowerment. They are not simply choices, they're needs. The same way you wouldn't expect someone who is able-bodied to sprout wings and fly, why do we expect people with disabilities to do things that we ourselves would not be able to do in their situation? Accessibility matters, and we see the way we talk about disability and accessibility, sorry, we see the way we talk about accessibility through our language, especially through our intersectionality. And so as you think about these slides and this presentation, I want you to ask yourself this one question. How can stereotypes on someone's social identities affect them day to day? Think about the Rubik's Cube. Think about the interactive exercise at the beginning. And thank you so much for listening to this presentation. Thank you.
I want to say thank you again to our interns, Rachel, Fia, and Danielle, for presenting today. Thank you very much for sharing this information. Okay, so I paused.